Hey everyone, I'm Alex, and today I want to talk about standardization. Why it's important for us to make things work the same and why it's so difficult to do so. When the libraries we use, when the technologies we build with, and the products that we create, when they work the same, this gives us a good developer productivity boost. It helps us move faster, but it comes at the cost of reduced autonomy and freedom in how we build things. And I know this is very abstract at first and is going to make sense in a second. So recently, a friend showed me the proposal to create something called a standard schema for schema validation libraries. So when you're doing HTTP requests or when you're working with forms or when you're reading messages from something like Kafka, for example, these like you receive data from an external source, and every time you receive data from an external source, you need to validate that data. Casting it to a type, even if you're using TypeScript, this is not enough because it doesn't actually validate that the content of the data is what you expect it to be. It only tells the compiler that this has the structure. So every time you have what people call a trust boundary, you need to validate that this data corresponds to the structure. Back in the day, we just used to validate every field, check for the existence of every field that we need, check if it's an email, a string, a phone number, whatever it is. And this led us to having like a whole bunch of small validation functions that you carry with yourself from project to project, and you just copy paste those utility functions everywhere. And with time, the community solved this, and people created schema validation libraries. So you no longer have to write your own validation rules every time. You no longer have to think about, how exactly do I parse this email and what are the rules for a correct email. You can just use those libraries, and they give you like a nice descriptive API. So you only need to say this, like this object needs to have this structure needs to have these fields. They need to be of these specific types. And naturally, like there isn't just one schema validation libraries. There are many of them. And right now, I think Zod is the most popular one, but we have AJV, Joy, and a whole bunch of others just in the JavaScript ecosystem. Having a bunch of different schema validation tools means that libraries that need to integrate with them need to support all those different tools. So one example for this is that if you're building a form, you don't really want to validate the form field by field. So if you're using something called a tool like React Hook Form, they accept an external schema that you can pass, and they validate the whole form against your schema. It's a great way to descriptively specify how the data that you expect is going to look like. But this puts like enormous burden on the developers because they need to support 5 or 6 different schema libraries. They need to have adapters for every different schema library because they don't know if you're going to use Zod, they don't know if you're going to use Joy, but they want to give you the ability to descriptively do validation. This is how library maintainers came to the proposal to standardize how schema validation libraries work. Not work exactly, because they only specify like the APIs that are going to be used by other libraries. So for me and you, we're just going to continue working with schema validation libraries as we used to do. Library maintainers are going to have a much easier time if schema validation libraries have a uniform interface, a uniform standard that they all follow. So instead of them having to maintain 5 or 6 different adapter functions that have to be modified every time a schema validation library changes how it works, they need to only follow one standard. And this is a great way to make things like to improve the developer experience. This is a great way to like simplify things because we are no longer going to have to use adapters. We're just going to have to pass the schema to the library. And I think this is a great solution. I think it's a great addition to the ecosystem. It's going to make things a lot better. The problem with this is that for a while, like until this gets adopted and until everyone manages to migrate to this and it gets accepted by the ecosystem, it's going to put an additional burden on library maintainers because they're going to have, until everyone migrates, they're going to have to both support like the schema validation, like the new standard, but they're also going to have to support all their adapters before they manage to migrate away from them. So this is something that very often happens in big companies. Startups they don't have this problem because they usually have smaller teams that work together. They work together on the same code base, and making changes happens a lot easier. They don't have to communicate up and down the chain. They don't have to communicate like to other teams. But like in big especially in corporations, this is something that I've seen many times over. Is like you have many teams that are both geographically distributed. They're distributed across time zones. They use different programming languages even, and in order for them to move productively they need a certain level of autonomy. So they need to be able to make their own decisions about what libraries they use. They need to know what they need to be able to make their own decisions about how like the format of the data that they're exposing, their APIs, their interfaces, and so on. Because you don't it's very hard to build software if like 2,000 people company need to agree on every small decision that has to be made. The problem arises when at some point in time, these different teams have to integrate with one another. So maybe you're building like a UI or some client or something that has to retrieve data from multiple from multiple systems owned by different teams. And this is where not having standards is going to hurt you, because you're going to have to start building a bunch of adapters and a bunch of functionality just to be able to easily work with all the data that is coming from the different teams. So what normally happens in a big company is that you've got a bunch of systems that are producing data with a different structure. And at some point, like maybe you need to consume this data. So you've got like a couple of clients here that need to consume data from system A and system B, and one that needs to consume data from these two. And what you would normally do is maybe A and B produce data with a different structure, and in order for you to work with a uniform structure, you're going to have two adapters that are going to make this data standardized and structured so this client can work with it. And the same for like for this client, in order for this data to look the same. So essentially you're going to, like, every client that you have is going to have like a bunch of adapters and mapping functions that they're going to have to maintain. And the problem with this is that you're going to start wasting a whole lot of time on these things here. When one system changes, you're going to have to update your adapters, and you're going to have to do this in multiple, like in every client that does this. And you may start thinking that libraries are a good solution, but then you have to maintain libraries and think about versioning, and this adds a whole nother layer of problems to this. So what most companies end up doing is figure out some intermediary layer that can standardize this. So you still got like your services here, but then you're gonna have like one middleman that then structures the schema and passes it like to the different clients. You're still gonna have that mapping layer, but it's gonna be like, it's not gonna live in every separate client. It's gonna live in one service in the middle that consumes all the information and passes it like to the clients that consume it. GraphQL is an intuitive way to solve this, but it's also a little bit of a trap because it adds additional complexity. It adds additional infrastructure that you have to maintain. The plus is that you have a single entry point. So every client can just communicate with one entry point instead of communicating with all those different underlying services. But an alternative to this is having each system map to like follow a specific standard about the data that they expose. And then whether you have this service in the middle or whether you communicate directly like to clients, it doesn't matter, because all your systems expose data in the same way. Whether you should have like a single entry point or whether you should have your clients communicate directly to the underlying services, this is a matter of system design. It's not something that we're going to talk about right now, but I just wanted to illustrate how many companies naturally end up with some form of standardization. What's the solution now? Should you have standards from the start? Should you, like, the first time you have to build like an API, should you say this is how all APIs should be structured? I don't think this is the way. It's very easy to overcorrect and go into this direction where you try to standardize everything, standardize how React components look and behave, standardize endpoints, messages. Like, teams need to have a certain level of autonomy in order for them to move productively. And if you try to standardize too early, you end up with a premature abstraction. It will be hard for you to accommodate all the problems that are going to arise. So you will end up changing this specification many times over, and it's not going to be productive. Like, the way to go about it is to give people freedom, see the patterns, see how things evolve, see who's using what, and then try to impose standards uh, as you start recognizing these needs. I think this is very similar to what is happening with the schema validation libraries that we spoke about. And this is something that happens in big companies. Like, at some point, you need to recognize, okay, we're having problems. This is kicking our ass. We need to, impose some standards, or we're going to end up just maintaining libraries and adapters and whatnot. And when exactly do you do this? I really can't answer, because this is more art than science. Like, you need to measure. Sometimes it's okay to take the productivity hit and just say, we're going to do some mapping here, and we're going to adapt this, like this structure, and that's fine. But when this starts becoming a repetitive pattern, you need to think whether you need some other whether you need a better solution to this. Okay, so this is going to be it for today. Just wanted to talk about standardization, because it's a problem that I've seen in many large corporations. It's a problem that many library communities have, and it's just something to keep in mind as if you happen to be in this situation. I hope you like the video, and see you in the next one.